It's good to see everybody today. I think I start all my sermons out that way. It's good to see everybody today. Someday I'm going to be like, I'm not happy to see y'all. Just kidding, but that wouldn't be true. I'd be lying. Well, so today I'm kind of doing a mixed sermon with Scott. So Scott's been doing what he's been calling the New Wine series, and that's looking at the life of Jesus and showing how the Old Testament points to that, prophesies that, and shadows that. And I've been talking about, Old Testament figures and spiritual lessons we can learn from their life. And what's cool about it is right now we're at the part of Jesus' life where he goes into the wilderness to be tempted of the devil. And we're also at the part with Israel where they're wandering through the wilderness. So it's just really neat how those two converge. So I'm coming over to Scott's side, and we're going to try this out. Because the story of Israel and the story of Jesus in the wilderness really mirror each other in really cool and interesting ways. But before we get to that, I want to take a little detour. Did anybody ever watch this show when you were a kid? Yes, I love this show. Young people don't know what they're missing. This is a great show. I was actually, when I was reminded of it, I was thinking I want to go back and look at it again because it was just really cool. And in this show, there are three main henchmen who are pretty much always in the way. Oh, there we go. It's these guys. Y'all remember these guys? And then later they get like transformed and they get powers and stuff. And they're always like, they're like doofuses, but they always show up like until later in the series. But I didn't watch the whole season, so I just remember them. They're like the three main bad guys, And I thought of them because as I was thinking about the temptations of Jesus, the temptation of Israel in the wilderness, it made me think of this passage in 1 John that I want to read with you, where John says something really interesting that I thought had some implications for what we're going to talk about. So he says this, 1 John 2. It says, "Do not love the world or the things that are in the world. If anyone loves the world, the Father's love is not in them. Everything in the world you see, the greedy desire of the flesh, the greedy desire of the mind, the pride of life, none of this is from the Father, it is from the world. The world is passing away with all its greedy desires, but anyone who does God's will abides forever." I just realized Joseph and I probably use different translations. Sorry about that. I use this translation, though, for a reason. But I want you to notice something interesting here. That, first of all, John says we should not love the world, right? And he doesn't mean don't love the people of the world, right? Or don't love our planet. The Bible says, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only son." So what John is talking about here is that there's a system in this world that we should not love. There is a direction that this world goes under the power of the devil that we should not embrace or love, and we should reject it instead. And he points out three main bad guys that pop up. And I liked how N.T. Wright translated it. That's why I used his translation. But he says, here in the ESV, it says, the desires of the flesh, the desires of the eyes, and pride of life. N.T. Wright translates it, the greedy desire of the flesh, the greedy desire of the mind, and the pride of life. And I like that because, again, we have to make sure we're understanding this. So like the desires of the flesh, not all desires of the flesh are bad. In fact, a lot of and when I say flesh, I mean our body, and actually John writing this book, the book of 1 John, he's doing it in part to refute this teaching called Gnosticism. And big tenet of Gnosticism was that everything that is physical, including our bodies, are bad. And John is saying no. Oh, and because they believe that, they said Jesus didn't actually come in a human body because the human body is inherently bad. So he couldn't have actually been a person. And John, a big part of 1 John is saying we saw him, we touched him, he had a physical body. So not everything of the flesh of our body is bad. For example, the desire for comfort, desire for warmth, desire for safety, even things like sexual desire, those aren't inherently bad. Okay, so that's why I like how N.T. Wright translated. He says the greedy desire of the flesh, the greedy desire of the mind. It's true with the mind too. Not everything your mind desires is bad. We desire friendship. We desire to create, to explore. Those are good things, right? Those are things that God gave us. But any of those things, if they become greedy, and this is what the system of the world is pushing for, when any of those things become greedy, then they become bad. So, for example, when a desire for food or comfort becomes excessive, when sexual desire gets out of control, when your desire for safety supersedes other people's safety, that is when the desires of the mind have become greedy and become out of control. Same with desires of the flesh. One knows. And the same with the mind. When friendship is not bad, but if your desire for friendship turns into envy and jealousy because someone else is hanging out with someone else and you want them to hang out with you, or you're jealous that other people have more friends than you do. When the desire to create and explore becomes a desire to conquer and subject others. When the desire for and often the desires of the mind that can be unhealthy, it can manifest in an excessive desire for things, for money, to store up all these things for yourself. And then pride, of course, that's an obvious one. And so it's interesting here because John says everything, in verse 16, he says, for all that is in the world, the greedy desire of the flesh, the greedy desires of the eyes of the mind, and the pride of life. That's everything that is in the world. And it's interesting because if you think about all the evil on earth, you can boil it down to one of these or a mixture of one of these things. And so in a way, that's why it made me think of those three bad guys. These are like the three goons of the world. They show up everywhere. Everywhere you look, politics, corrupt business, our personal lives, anything that's bad, it boils down to something here. Something's gone out of whack. The desires of our flesh have become greedy. The desires of our mind have become greedy. And so we're at the point of the story with Jesus and the Israelites where they're wandering through the wilderness, right? And what's interesting to me is that in both of their wildernesses, they face these temptations. That's why I want to talk about this. And they handle them differently. In Jesus and in Israel, you see a contrast. Israel was chosen by God to be a blessing and to spread his name to the world, but they failed constantly. Their journey through the wilderness is like just a constant failing, And even into the promised land, they are constantly failing. But Jesus comes, and he's the true embodiment of what God wanted Israel to be. And he succeeds where Israel fails. And so Israel in the Old Testament, it shows us its failures, and then the Old Testament points to the one who would come and truly satisfy and do what God wanted him to do. Through him, all the nations of the earth would be blessed. So what I want to do today is I want to compare Jesus in the wilderness with Israel in the wilderness, show how they wrestled with these temptations and how they handled them differently. So that's what we're going to do. So if you got the Bible, go ahead and go to Luke chapter 4. And we're going to start in verse 1. It says this: Jesus, full of the Holy Spirit, returned from the Jordan, and he was led by the Spirit in the wilderness for 40 days, being tempted by the devil. And he ate nothing during those days, and when they were ended, he was hungry. I can't imagine not eating for 40 days. Okay, so Jesus has just been baptized, like Scott talked about last week. Notice a couple of things in this passage here. He's full of the Spirit, right? He's walking in accordance with God's will, and that the Spirit leads him into the wilderness, okay? And you see the wilderness several times throughout the Bible. And the wilderness, when people are in it, it's always a place that's wild and difficult. It's a place where everything is removed, all the distraction, and it's just you and God. And it's a place where the real you is uncovered. It's a place where everything that's raw and real comes out. And I think the biggest thing about the wilderness is that it's a place where only God can sustain you. And I want you to see that the Spirit led him into the wilderness, led him into this place that was wild and difficult and dangerous. The Spirit led him into a place where only God's strength could get him through. Like Scott likes to say, some people say God won't give you more than you can handle. But I think the truth of life is that God will give you more than you can handle, and he will allow more than you can handle into your life. God will lead you into uncomfortable and difficult and scary places of obedience and places where you're only going to get through with his strength. He will do that because really what our lives are supposed to be. Humans weren't ever made to exist apart from God. We were always made to live a supernatural life. We're always made to live a life that can't be explained just in terms of our human capability. And so that's why the Bible talks about like peace that passes understanding, rejoicing in all things, abounding in love, patient in hope. Like those are things that aren't of us. They come from God. They're supernatural, right? And God is leading us into a life where we are stripped of our own strength and we depend on him. Like it's like, God, the only way I'm going to get through this is with your strength. And that's the perfect place to be. And so God leads his son Jesus, who's living the perfect life of a man. He leads his son Jesus into this wilderness, and he's stripped of all his physical strength. He fasts for 40 days. He's tempted of the devil. He eats nothing. And when they were ended, he was hungry. Going on to verse 3. And the devil says to him, "If you are the Son of God, command this stone to become bread." And this is the first temptation. Jesus, I guess, as far as we understand, has been told by God to fast, to wait, right? And the devil comes to him, and man, the devil always has these really amazing questions. He says, if you're the Son of God, command the stone to become bread. I guess it's not a question. It's more of an implication, you know? I guess what he's implying is like, aren't you the Son of God? Don't you have the right to eat? Don't you have the power to feed yourself? Are you really who you say you are? If you're the Son of God, command this stone to become bread. If you're the Son of God, why are you sitting out here not eating? Turn this into bread and eat it. Jesus is hungry and weak and tired. And the devil is approaching him here with the desires of his flesh, and he's tempting him. He's saying, look, you're hungry, you're starving, and you're the Son of God. You have the right to eat. Just turn it into bread. And so Jesus is faced with a struggle. It's like, am I going to prioritize my Father's will over my own fleshly desires right now? Or am I going to choose to turn the stone into bread? It's really interesting because Israel faced something very similar in Exodus 16 when they're wandering through the wilderness. This was just about a month and a half after they leave Egypt. So it says, they set out from Elim, and all the congregation of the people of Israel came to the wilderness of Sin. I love that. I know that's a Hebrew word, but it just fits so well with our English. The wilderness of Sin. It's kind of fitting. Anyways, it's between Elim and Sinai on the 15th day of the second month after they had departed from the land of Egypt. And the whole congregation of the people of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. The people of Israel said to them, would that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the meat pots and ate the bread to the full. You have brought us out in this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. So Israel and Jesus are in the same boat in some ways. They've both been led into the wilderness, and they're both super hungry. And Israel decides that even though they just saw God part the Red Sea, and even though just before this passage, God had given them water that when they didn't have any water, They begin to grumble and complain. They want to turn back. And I was thinking about this, though. I was like, man, I got to cut the Israelites some slack, because I can't count how many times I felt like God wanted me to do something and it was hard. And when I got into it, it was hard, and I got frustrated, get mad. Like, God, why would you do this? I'm trying to obey you. I'm trying to do what you want me to do. It's not easy. And that was Israel's way, man. It's like when things got hard, instead of trusting God, they just wanted to quit. They just want to go back. They just want to give up on God, It's like, I'm trying to follow this God thing, and it's not easy, and it's difficult, and I'm not getting everything I want. Let's just go back to Egypt. But God had mercy on them, and he feeds them supernaturally with manna. This is where they start to get manna. And every day, God gave them just enough. They would each collect just enough for that day. They didn't have any left over for the next day. And then the next day, God would give them what they need. And I think that's part of why we pray in the Lord's Prayer, give us this day our daily bread. Because God was trying to teach Israel in the wilderness to trust that he would care for their needs one day at a time. And Jesus knew that. And so he says to the devil for this temptation, it is written, man shall not live by bread alone. And he's quoting a verse from Deuteronomy 8:3. And Moses is talking to them about this situation where they were in the wilderness and they doubted God, and he started to feed them with manna. And the whole thing says, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of the Lord. And Jesus, he trusted God. And man, I just think that's so amazing, because he hasn't eaten for 40 days. I mean, he's like very close to dying if he doesn't get food. But he trusted that his Father cared about his needs. He was not going to put the desires of his flesh above his trust in God. He knew he was where his Father wanted him, and he trusts that God would provide for him at the right time. Isn't that amazing? And this is the kind of life God wants us to have. And I'm not standing here acting like I've got it all figured out. I feel like a lot of times we're very much in between the Israelites and Jesus, It's like, we want to trust God. We're not trying to go back to our old life, but we're also like frustrated about where we're at right now and not happy with how things are going, And Jesus tells us in Luke 12 that we don't need to worry about our physical needs. We don't have to worry about them. He says, don't worry about what you're going to eat. Don't worry about what you're going to drink or what you're going to wear. Seek first the kingdom. And that's going to look different in all of our lives. For some of us, that means we go be missionaries. And for some of us, that means we start a business that's really successful. But at the end of the day, we're not doing it to just get everything we want. We're not doing it for the greedy desire of the flesh. We should be doing it because that's what God wants us to do. And we're trying to seek his kingdom first. And we're trusting him to meet our needs, whether we know how it's going to work or not. And so the devil failed to convince Jesus to put the desires of his flesh above obedience to his Father. So the first goon didn't work, so he tries something else. So the devil takes him up. Luke 4, we're in verse 5. And the devil took him up and showed him all the kingdoms of the world in a moment of time. And he said to him, to you I will give all this authority and their glory, for it has been delivered to me, and I will give it to whom I will. If you then will worship me, it will all be yours. I had a funny thought. I wonder if the devil was really going to do that or not. Do you think the devil would try to scam the Son of God? Like, maybe this is the most honest deal the devil ever would have made, It's like, maybe if Jesus would just compromise a little bit, the devil would have given him all the kingdoms of the world and their glory. I don't know. And so here the devil is appealing to the lust of the eyes or the mind. He's like, look, all this power, all this glory, everything you could ever want, I'm going to give it to you. No more poverty, Jesus. No more struggle. No more sleeping on stones. Like he said, all it takes is a little under-the-table compromise. He's in the wilderness. Who's going to know that Jesus bowed down to the devil? Who's going to see it? Nobody. It's perfect. He can get everything your mind or heart could desire, and from a worldly sense. All he has to do is a little compromise that no one will ever see or know about. Israel fell into idolatry so many times. Because that's really what it is. It's idolatry. When we choose to compromise in order to get something, when we choose to do what's wrong in order to get something, we're putting more stock in that than we are in God. We're worshiping that more than God. So Israel, it took them just 40 days with Moses being gone, and they make a golden calf. They each throw in a little bit of gold, and they start to worship that. Another time, Balaam, this prophet, convinces a king to send in his people into the Israelite camp and to start to get them to come to their feasts and get them to come to their celebrations where they bow down and worship false gods, and to slowly suck Israel into that false worship. And man, I think we can all easily understand how we're tempted this way, Especially in America. We're tempted to prioritize wealth, power, and glory over obedience to God. And y'all know, there are so many little ways we can compromise to get things that we want. In truth, like I said, we're choosing to worship the things of this world instead of worshiping God. And that's why Jesus responds to the devil the way he does. He says in verse 8, "It is written, you shall worship the Lord your God, and him only shall you serve." He said, "I'm not going to worship you or the things of this world in order to gain temporary power and glory. I worship God alone." When we stand before God, I think that's why part of the reason why I think being a part of a church is so important. Not just to hear sermons and stuff like that. We need help to keep our vision on the final day when we stand before God, because it's so easy in the day-to-day to get caught up in our work and our life and to forget that one day we're going to stand before God. And it doesn't matter at that point how much money we had. It's going to matter how we got it and what we did with it, right? That's what's going to matter. Did we get it in a way that honors God? If we're in a position of power, if we're in a position where we're a leader, how did we get there? Did we do it in a way that honored God? And what did we do with that position when we were there? We need to lift our eyes to God so that we worship him alone. Lastly, the devil tempted Jesus with one more approach. And this one has always been so interesting to me. So he took him, starting in verse 9, he took him to Jerusalem, set him on the pinnacle of the temple, and he said to him, "If you are the Son of God, throw yourself down from here. For it is written, he will command his angels concerning you to guard you. On their hands they will bear you up, lest you strike your foot against a stone." This is a really interesting temptation here. I was like, it's taken me some time to really understand what, and I hope I understand. I'm still trying to figure it out. But if you think I get it wrong, come tell me after the sermon, okay? But I think that the devil is trying to appeal to pride in Jesus. Again, he says, "If you're the Son of God, throw yourself down." And then he quotes a verse in Psalm 91 where God promises that he'll protect his anointed. And so he says to him, in essence, you can jump off this temple and God will protect you. And then I think what's going on here, if he jumps off the temple and God sends angels to rescue him, everybody in Jerusalem is going to know that he's the Son of God, right? And so the devil's kind of telling him, hey, look, you're the Son of God. You can just throw yourself off of here Everyone's going to see that you're the Son of God, and it's going to be great, All Jesus has to do is take a prideful step outside of God's will and do something that he thinks is better than God's plan. And he's also trying to get Jesus to presume that God will protect him if he does something that God didn't tell him to do. God didn't tell him to throw himself off the temple. The devil did. But he's like, well, look, there's this verse. It doesn't matter. You can just go throw yourself off the temple. It'll be fine. God's already promised to protect you, And that's what the Bible calls testing God. It's like trying to corner God into an area where he has to respond. It's like holding the Bible against him almost. Israel does something similar in the wilderness. In Exodus 17, they demand that God send them water. And again, they're grumbling and complaining not long after he started giving them manna. And it says they tested him by saying, is God really among us or not? They're like, God, you have to prove it. Are you really among us or not? If you are, give us water. And so I think in both situations, there's a presumption and a pride that's not good. And so the devil's going the third avenue. He tried the greedy desire of the flesh, the greedy desire of the mind. Now he's trying to get Jesus to act in a prideful way, test God, try to bring glory to himself in a way that God didn't want him to. And so Jesus says to him, it is said, you shall not put the Lord your God to the test. And when the devil had ended every temptation, he departed from him until an opportune time. This wasn't the last time that Jesus would face these temptations, but that was it for this time. And again, it's interesting how it says after the devil had ended every temptation, those three things, the greedy desire of the flesh, the greedy desire of the mind, the pride of life, those are the three ways the devil tried to get him. Those are the three forces in this world, and none of them worked. Jesus stood tall where Israel failed. So, I think we all kind of find ourselves in between Israel and Jesus a lot of times, I think pretty much all of us desire to walk with God. We don't want to go back to Egypt. But we find that temptation, the greedy desire of the flesh, the greedy desire of the mind, the pride coming at us, trying to get us to stumble. And I guess I just wanted to encourage y'all today that God's going to give you the power to overcome, just like he did. And I also think this is a good opportunity to kind of look at ourselves today and ask if we are compromising in any area of our life that we shouldn't be. Are we allowing some desire of the flesh to supersede our obedience to God? Are we allowing some desire for material things to get us to compromise in a way that we know we shouldn't? Are we walking in pride in a way that we need to lay down? I think this temptation in the wilderness illuminates the way the devil is going to try and bring us down. And it's an opportunity to bring those things to God and say, God, you helped your son Jesus in the wilderness. So Jesus, I'm asking you to help me now to get right, to overcome these temptations. I'm just thankful that we have a faithful high priest, He knows what we're going through because he went through it, and he will help us. So it's not a mind-blowing message or anything, but I hope it's a good encouragement and just a reminder. I hope that if God's putting anything on your heart, that you'll talk to him about it. You won't just put it on the back burner and walk out of here without dealing with it, I hope that you will learn to depend on God. That's what I want to do. And I hope we'll all pursue that. So